He came back from another life knowing exactly how this story ended. He had played the game, every dungeon, every cutscene, every story branch. He knew the main character's name and his rival's sword. He knew which professors had signed deals with demon lords and which battles would shake the sky. He had one condition for this second life: stay out of all of it. The world said no immediately. Here was the truth that nobody in this academy knew. Not the proud nobles in their colored uniforms. Not the famous sword masters watching from their tower windows. Not the demons gathering strength 3 years away in the dark. A reincarnated Korean chef, carrying 2 sashimi knives and a box cutter, was the most dangerous student who had ever walked through these gates. And every step he took to remain invisible would shove him further into the center of a story he had no intention of starring in. Rewind to his first morning. Rewind to the registration desk, and the moment everything started going wrong. His name was Kang Gyama. Previous life: chef, army conscript, decade-long student of the cutting blade in a restaurant where a single salmon fillet could take 30 minutes to prepare correctly. He had reached the top of a very narrow field and found nothing waiting there but more work. Then he died, and he woke up here, in a body that was thin and undertrained, in a world that was the mobile game he had played on his phone during every break shift for 3 years. Miracle Blessing M. Fantasy Kingdom, Noble Academy, Ranked Dungeons, Demon War incoming. He had the wiki memorized. His plan: enroll, attend classes, score low, graduate, survive the demon war from a supply room somewhere. Live the quiet, comfortable youth his previous life had refused him. At the registration desk, the clerk looked at his weapons declaration form. Then looked at it again. Gyama had listed 2 kitchen knives and a box cutter. The clerk called the supervising professor. The professor came over, read the form, and asked, with the careful patience of a man who was not yet certain this was happening, whether the student was serious. Gyama said he was. The professor looked at the knives in the carrying sleeve under Gyama's arm, then at the green badge clipped to his collar that marked him as a special admission student, not noble, not wealthy, and apparently not in possession of even basic social awareness. He stamped the form and walked away without another word. Gyama pinned his badge and walked through the gates. Around him, other incoming students carried enchanted longswords, family heirlooms, custom-forged weapons that had names. He breathed the campus air and thought, 3 years. Just 3 years. Upstairs, behind a window that looked out over the registration courtyard, an old man with white hair and one functional arm had gone very still. He had developed, over 80 years of sword work, a sensitivity to how people occupied space, the way weight sat in the hips, the way eyes moved through a crowd before the head did. This black-haired boy at the registration desk was doing something with his posture that the old man recognized and had not expected to see in an incoming first year. He kept watching long after the boy passed through the gates. 2 days later, the school held its allocation ceremony. Students were sent into subspace, a training dimension where pain was real but death didn't stick, and given 3 hours to fight and demonstrate their ability. The result determined their class ranking. Top tier was Star. Below that, Dragon, Tiger, Wolf, and a 5th designation that existed more as a warning than a category. Gyama's strategy was simple and complete. Find the edge of the terrain, stay still, avoid everyone, and wait it out. He settled into a hollow between 2 boulders with the bread he had saved from breakfast. Around him, distant fighting echoed through the trees. He ate methodically, chewing without hurry. The bread was dry, but it would do. The screaming started about 20 minutes in. The Mao twins had been at work since the opening bell. Mao Jun and Shin Mao, children of a high house, placed into subspace with the energy of cats introduced to an unsupervised room. They weren't competing, they were establishing territory. The weaker students they found were not defeated. They were held and given reasons to remember who had held them. Several people had already stopped moving by the time Gyama moved through the trees toward the sound. He came out at the edge of a clearing. A girl was on the ground against a boulder, hands over her head, entirely still. Not playing dead, genuinely gone, folded into herself in the way people go when they have decided the situation is beyond them. Shin Mao stood over her, talking. Mao Jun watched with the relaxed attention of someone who had seen this before and found it predictable. Something went quiet inside Gyama's chest. He had felt this quiet before. In the army, his last year of service, watching a senior put his boot on a junior's hands and laugh. The quiet was not anger. It was a door closing on a specific option. He stepped into the clearing. Shin Mao turned and took in the green badge, the kitchen knives, the cheap uniform. He said several things. Gyama stopped listening after the first sentence. The twin raised his sword and moved. Gyama activated the blessing of painlessness. The blessing system in this world organized power into tiers. Personal spirit at the base, then guardian, then true spirit, and at the absolute pinnacle, barely documented, achieved only once in recorded history, the heroic tier. Blessings were inherited, soul-bound, fixed at birth. Gyama had two that fit together in a way the blessing system had not anticipated. The first was the blessing of the sword god, a divine ability tied to an ancient deity the academic tradition considered mythology. When activated through a blade, it channeled the instinct and precision of a swordsman who had spent centuries mastering nothing else. The cost was physical, not mana, not stamina. Pure agony, the kind that shredded muscles and built toward the point where the body simply stopped cooperating. The second was the blessing of painlessness. 30 seconds of total pain suppression. Nothing more, nothing less. 30 seconds was his budget. He had never needed all of it. Shin Mao's sword moved toward Gyama's collarbone. Fast, technically clean, aimed at exactly the point where the strike would end things immediately. The sashimi knife was already out. The motion was small, the way a chef's first cut into a fish is small. Elbow in, wrist angled, no wasted movement. The twins' sword arms stopped at a diagonal. Shin Mao looked down at the ground beside him, processing what he was seeing. Then he sat down. Mao Jun came in heavy. All mass and momentum, a charge designed to punish clever fighters who had already been clever once. He closed the gap in 2 steps and launched a combination that most third-year students would have stepped back from. Gyama didn't step back. He stepped inside the charge, inside the range where the sword's length stopped being useful, and made 2 cuts. The combination stopped. Mao Jun found himself looking at the flat of a sashimi knife held 3 centimeters from his right eye, completely still. It was over. Gyama lowered the blade. The 30-second clock expired. Pain immunity dissolved, and the sword god's debt arrived all at once. A wave that hit from the spine outward, locking every joint. He went to 1 knee, then to 2. He held position through the first several seconds by will alone, then the ground came up anyway, and he was on his back staring at subspace's artificial sky. The girl against the boulder had not moved. She was watching him with gray eyes that had seen too much for someone her age. Neither of them said anything. He woke in the medical clinic. The ceiling was clean and white. His knives were on the table beside the bed, arranged with an odd neatness, parallel, equidistant, as though someone had placed them with care. His hand found them before his eyes had fully opened. 2 visitors were waiting in chairs across the room. The woman had curly hair and an expression of cheerful interest, the kind that belongs to someone who considers other people's extraordinary problems entertaining rather than distressing. Director Media, as the students called her, one of the 7-star heroes, the most widely decorated combatant of her generation, and, per the game wiki that Gyama had read at 1 a.m. in a restaurant break room in his previous life, the first of those 7 who would not survive the coming demon war. He had hoped never to meet her. The man beside her had white hair and an arm that ended at the shoulder, the empty sleeve hanging with practiced stillness. Siegfried Fanibalong, the Sword Emperor, humanity's greatest living swordsman. He was looking at Gyama's hands with an expression Gyama could not fully read, which was unusual. He could read most expressions. They asked careful questions. He gave careful answers. Media informed him, with the pleased air of someone delivering good news, that he had scored highest in the allocation test. Star class placement was his if he wanted it. He said he would prefer Wolf class. Her expression shifted by exactly the degree that expressions shift when expectations have been kicked sideways. She asked why. He said Wolf sounded comfortable. She pointed out that Wolf was the 2nd lowest tier and that no special admission student had ever requested a downgrade on purpose. He asked if there was a rule against it. There wasn't. They negotiated. He would take Wolf, and his score would remain private. Media agreed with the look of someone filing a note in a location they intended to revisit. Siegfried said nothing during any of this, which Gyama found more unsettling than anything the director had said. Wolf class was quieter than he had feared. The students there had already made peace with being exactly where they were. No status anxiety, no territorial behavior, just people who had decided to exist without aggressively justifying it. Nobody examined his green badge and decided to make something of it. He found a seat near the back, set his knives under the desk, and got to work on being forgettable. A girl sat one row to his left. She had long silver hair and a way of holding herself very still, the kind of stillness that is learned rather than natural. When introductions came around, she gave her name as Chloe Aditori. Her smile was perfectly correct, the smile of someone who had practiced it until it reliably produced the right response in other people. Gyama recognized the family name and filed it. The Aditori were not noble in the way most academy families were noble. They were hired. They were exceptionally good at one specific thing, and swordsmanship in the general athletic sense was only a part of it. He did not look at her again that morning. The first week was manageable. He trained before dawn, when the gymnasium was empty, running the knife forms that his previous body had spent a decade building into muscle memory. His new body stumbled through them. The muscles were raw and undertrained, but the mind moved through the movements like water through a familiar channel. The rebuilding was tedious. It was also the most peaceful part of his day. The cafeteria was the problem. The food was extraordinary and priced for families that had crests with Latin mottos. His scholarship stipend covered the cheapest tier, which was still better than most of what he'd eaten in his previous life, but the arithmetic was tight. Media found him counting coins outside the cafeteria on the third day. She sat down uninvited and slid a meal card across the table. She said it was standard for special admission students. He doubted that completely, but he took the card. On Thursday evening, Chloe arrived at his dormitory door. She held a covered bowl and wore an expression combining extreme determination with visible discomfort. She said she owed him for the placement test. He said she didn't. She said she was going to cook him dinner. He stepped aside. She moved through his small kitchen with focused intensity, treating each step like a task to be executed correctly. The food was careful and balanced, the cooking of someone who had learned from duty rather than warmth, who had followed instructions for years and was only now, awkwardly, learning what cooking for someone felt like. He told her it was excellent. She looked at her own hands like they had surprised her. He was making tea when he saw the notebook on the counter. It was open. His name caught his eye before he could stop it, along with 3 lines of handwriting below it that were clearly not a shopping list. He set the notebook back down exactly as it had been and looked away. Chloe came back from the bathroom. She looked at the notebook. She looked at him. The expression on her face began to change in a way that suggested something had come undone below the surface, something that had been held in careful arrangement and was now losing its geometry. He reached into his right pocket. The box cutter extended. He didn't point it at her. He moved it in a quarter arc, the tight, controlled motion of trimming close to a surface, and a thin lock of silver hair drifted from her temple to the floor. Chloe stopped. He said, quietly, that he hadn't read it. He used the voice he'd learned in a restaurant kitchen where a line cook with a cleaver had once needed talking down at 2 a.m, flat, certain, leaving no room for the situation to escalate. She looked at the hair on the floor. The change in her face held still, then slowly reversed. She tucked the notebook under her arm and left without looking at him. He stood in the kitchen for a while. He poured his tea. He thought about the Aditori clan, the particular kind of training that produced that specific speed and that specific blankness behind the eyes. He thought about the next 3 years. He thought, manageable. He found her in the gymnasium the following week, before first class. She was running sword forms alone. Technically, the execution was close to perfect. Every angle correct, every transition without waste, the footwork cleaner than most Dragon class students. But watching her, Gyama felt something he had occasionally seen in apprentice chefs trained under fear rather than patience. The body present, the person absent. The muscles knew what to do. Whatever was behind them had long since stopped caring. He asked if she wanted a sparring partner. She looked at him for a long moment, as if checking whether there was a catch. He held up one of the kitchen knives. She lowered her practice sword and assumed a stance. They started meeting there every morning. Real trouble arrived on a Tuesday. Her training sword broke mid-exchange, a stress fracture in the hilt that had been building for longer than anyone had noticed, releasing all at once with a sharp crack. Metal failing under tension made a specific sound. Gyama's hand tightened on his knife handle the instant he heard it. The blessing of the sword god did not require conditions. It asked only for the right stimulus. A blade, a grip tightening, the geometry of proximity to a threat. When it arrived, it came total. The gymnasium resolved into something beyond ordinary sight. Every grain of the wood floor, every particle suspended in the window light, the exact position of the girl 3 meters away, and the precise lines along which she was open. His arm moved before he had made any decision. He crossed the gymnasium in less than a second. Chloe was fast, trained since childhood fast, and she got her forearm up in time to redirect rather than take the blade across the face. They hit the wall together, his knife edge close enough to her throat that a deliberate movement would have mattered. She said his name, just his name, at normal volume, the way someone says a name to get attention. The sword god released. He stepped back. His arm was shaking slightly, the aftershock of forces it had not been built to carry. He said he was sorry. She said she was fine. There was a bruise forming on her forearm from the redirect. She said it anyway. They stood on opposite ends of the gymnasium. Neither spoke. He stared at the broken practice sword on the floor and reminded himself, carefully, that the blessing was not a skill he possessed. It was something older than him and considerably less interested in his preferences. He would need to account for that. He didn't know, that morning, that in a corridor on the other side of the campus, Chloe's older brother had received a report. Nox Auditory, 14 years old, declared by the family to be the pinnacle of the clan's dark arts, the name spoken about with the careful reverence reserved for dangerous tools, had heard about the placement test results. He had heard about the special admission student with the kitchen knives. He had heard that this student had been spending time with his sister. He had decided to introduce himself. Gyama would have approximately 1 more week of quiet. The kind of quiet, as it turned out, that only exists immediately before something ends it. Nox found him between the second-floor library and the east stairwell, at a time when the corridor was mostly empty, which suggested the timing was not accidental. He was shorter than Gyama had expected. The reputation arrived before him like weather before a storm, and reputations of that kind usually attach themselves to people who looked the part. Nox was slight, dark-haired, wearing his uniform with the precise fit of someone who considered appearance a form of statement. He stopped in the center of the corridor and said Gyama's name the way someone says a word they've been practicing. 3 other auditory students fanned out behind him at a spacing that was professional rather than dramatic. Not a crowd, a formation. Nox spoke. He said that he was there out of courtesy rather than hostility. He said that Chloe's situation within the family was not a matter for outside involvement. He said that Gyama had, perhaps without fully understanding, created an imbalance that would require correction. Gyama listened. He noted the word choices: courtesy, imbalance, correction, the vocabulary of someone who had learned to package force inside the language of reasonableness. He had met this type before. His old master had spoken exactly this way in the week before he'd handed Gyama his severance. When Nox finished, Gyama walked forward. Nox did not move. Neither did his 3 companions. The corridor was perhaps 4 meters wide. Gyama walked through the space between Nox and the right-hand wall at normal pace, close enough that Nox's sleeve brushed his shoulder. He did not look at the auditory students as he passed. He said, over his shoulder, without stopping, that if Nox wanted to correct anything, the subspace arena accepted reservation requests through the school office, and there was an open slot on Friday at noon. He went down the stairs. Behind him, Nox stood very still for several seconds. Then he went to reserve the slot. Friday drew an audience nobody had specifically invited. Word traveled the way word traveled in institutions with too many people and not enough happening. An upperclassman mentioned it to a friend, who mentioned it to 3 others, who told their entire dormitory floor. By the time Gyama arrived at the arena entrance, the observation gallery above was 3/4 full. He recognized maybe 4 people in it. He did not look for specific faces. Nox was already on the arena floor, center positioned, his 3 companions in the observers section, with expressions suggesting complete confidence in the outcome. Subspace rules were straightforward. Injuries were real. Death didn't transfer back. A victory condition was opponent incapacitated or yielded. The timer was 30 minutes. Gyama had no intention of using all of it. Nox drew first, a blade that had clearly been made for him specifically. waited for a smaller frame, kept sharp at exactly the angles that mattered for a cutting style that targeted joints and tendons rather than bulk strikes. The Auditory didn't fight to overwhelm, they fought to dismantle. Know the target's weak lines and open them, one at a time, until nothing held the structure together. It was, Gyama had to acknowledge, an excellent philosophy for humans fighting humans. He took out a kitchen knife in each hand and stood in the only guard position he had ever used. Low, weight back, hands in the placement that 30 years of fish and vegetable preparation had made his default resting state. The gallery made a sound he didn't track. Nox moved. The dark arts that the Auditory taught were not tricks. They were a legitimate methodology. Precision strikes, blind angle approaches, misdirection that exploited the eye's natural tracking tendency. Nox had been trained to fight people who were faster than him, larger than him, more powerful than him, by making sure none of those advantages applied to the instant when the fight actually ended. It worked on a staggering percentage of opponents. He came in with a feint toward the lead shoulder and converted to a low cut aimed at the back of the knee. The motion so fluid that it genuinely looked like the high strike right until it didn't. Most fighters reacted to the high and paid for it. Gyama had filleted fish at speed for 20 years. His hands were used to working in the space while his eyes were somewhere else entirely. He tracked the blade at the wrist rather than the shoulder, felt the conversion happening 3 centimeters into it, and stepped left into the cut rather than away from it. The blade crossed behind him. His right-hand knife came across at the same moment, and Nox's left arm from elbow to wrist abruptly had a new geometry. Nox stepped back. He looked at his arm with the careful attention of someone reading a document they hadn't expected to receive. Gyama waited. The 3 companions in the observation section had gone very still. Nox came again. Good instinct, not stopping to absorb what had happened, pressing before the psychology could turn against him. He went high with both hands, a genuine overhead strike that carried real commitment, designed to test whether the first cut had been skill or chance. 2 kitchen knives crossed, the overhead committed, both of Nox's arms redirected through a path his shoulders hadn't planned for, and the next thing his body registered was the floor against his back. Gyama's left-hand knife rested at his sternum. His right-hand knife was placed at the junction of Nox's jaw and ear, not pressing, just present, communicating precisely the degree to which the current situation was finished. The gallery did not make any sound at all for a moment. Then several things happened at once, none of which Gyama paid attention to. He removed both knives, straightened up, and walked to the arena exit. The announcement of his win played through the arena speakers. He had used 11 seconds of his 30-second window. He visited the hospital that evening. The medics had set the arm. Nox was propped against pillows, looking at the wall across from his bed with the expression of someone whose understanding of the world had recently undergone structural renovation. His 3 companions had apparently left. The room held the particular silence of a person alone with an outcome they hadn't prepared for. Gyama pulled the chair from the desk and sat down. He took an apple from the fruit bowl on the bedside table, the standard hospital welcome basket, pears and apples with a card from the school administration, and produced his smaller kitchen knife from his sleeve. He began to peel it. The peel came off in a single continuous ribbon, turning from the blade with the smooth inevitability of something that had been done enough times to become mechanical. When the apple was completely bare, he cut it. The slices were identical in thickness. He did not look at his hands during any of this. Nox's eyes followed the knife the entire time. Gyama held out a slice. Nox, after a moment, took it. Gyama said that Chloe trained in the gymnasium before sunrise most mornings. He said she had stopped holding her practice sword like it was a tool she had been assigned, and started holding it like it was something she had chosen. He said he had noticed the difference, and thought Nox might want to know about it. He put the remaining slices on the bedside table, and left the knife beside them. The handle toward Nox, the blade away, the same arrangement he'd always used when leaving a knife for someone else to pick up. He did not say anything else. Nox watched him leave. The apple slices stayed on the table untouched for a while. Then Nox picked one up, ate it slowly, and stared at the empty space where Gyama had been sitting. Abel found the empty bench behind the dormitory buildings at 10:30 on a Thursday night, which meant Gyama had already been there for 40 minutes and had almost finished the moon dumplings he'd bought from the street vendor near the west gate. She sat at the far end without asking. This was the kind of bench that existed in the gaps between campus geography, too far from the main buildings to be useful, too lit by the secondary lamp to be fully private. People went there to be alone, in a way that still included ambient evidence of other people. She said after a while that she had lost. He said the placement test results. She said yes. She had lost to an anonymous score and spent a month trying to find out who belonged to it, and the administration had told her it was confidential, and the student had apparently selected to be in Wolf class, which made no structural sense to anyone she'd spoken to about it. He ate a dumpling. She said it was not, technically, her business. She said that she was accustomed to being first, that her bloodline expected it, and that she had no framework for what to do with a number above her own that came with no name attached. She said this with the precise tightness of someone making a confession they had no intention of following with apology. He said that sounded frustrating. She looked at him with the slight angle that meant she wasn't sure whether he was commiserating or patronizing. He was looking at the dumplings. She concluded, apparently, that he was just eating. They sat for another 20 minutes without speaking. When she left, she said goodnight. He said the same. She walked back toward the main buildings and did not look behind her. He finished his dumplings. The lamp above the bench hummed softly. He had been talking to the game's main heroine for half an hour. She had been talking to the anonymous student above her on every ranking board, and neither of them had provided the information that would have made the conversation significantly more interesting. He considered this a qualified success. Leon arrived on a Tuesday morning in the third week of term. Gyama had known he was coming. The game's timeline was reliable up to the midpoint, and the main protagonist's enrollment triggered the actual story. He had spent the preceding week attempting to optimize his invisibility. No unusual scores, no incidents, no remarkable behavior of any kind. Then Knox's arena duel had gone out over the school's general announcement channel, so most of the campus already knew his name when Leon walked through the gates. The timing was not ideal. Leon was tall, fair-haired, carrying himself with the careful balance of someone who has developed the habit of not taking up more room than necessary. He stopped at the registration desk, produced his weapons declaration form, and listed one sword. The clerk stamped it. Leon looked around the courtyard with the slow attention of someone who was looking for something specific without wanting to appear to be looking. His gaze passed over Gyama, stopped for a fraction of a second, and moved on. Gyama turned and walked to class. The first time Rachel Dura directly entered his life, she brought Abel with her. Rachel was the niece of the Spear Saint, a fact her posture had memorized and could not stop announcing, and she had decided, based on reasoning she did not bother to explain, that Gyama was interesting enough to visit. She walked into his Wolf class classroom during the midday break, trailing Abel like a reluctant afterthought, and told Gyama that she had heard about the Knox duel and wanted to see if the reality matched the story. Abel stood in the doorway with the expression of someone who had agreed to one thing and was now experiencing another. Chloe had been sitting at her desk eating a rice ball when they walked in. She looked up at Rachel, then at Abel, then at Gyama, and set her rice ball down very carefully. Gyama told them both that Wolf class was not a tourist attraction, and that if they wanted to visit a student they could submit a formal request through the school office like ordinary people. Rachel looked at Chloe. Chloe looked at Rachel with the flat patience of a body of water waiting for the weather to change. Gyama stood up and held the door open. Rachel left first, which Gyama suspected was a form of tactical retreat she'd dressed up as confidence. Abel left second, pausing at the door for one moment without fully turning around. She said, at normal volume, that Wolf class had interesting people. He said the door closed on its own if she let go of it. She let go of it. Chloe retrieved her rice ball. The room settled. Gyama sat back down and returned to the training notes he had been reviewing, thinking about the midterm and the island, and the 30-day window before things got significantly more complicated. The midterm was held on Scopuli Island. The setup was standard for the Academy's practical exam structure. Take a party of 5 into a designated zone, clear the assigned dungeon, return with proof before the time limit expired. The zone assigned to Gyama's group was a sea cave network on the island's northern face, rated for moderate difficulty, expected to contain approximately 60 standard mermen. Gyama's party, himself, Chloe, Leon, Rachel, and Speedweapon. Speedweapon, whose actual name was longer and more formal and that nobody used, played a flute and buffed party members through sound-based blessing work. He was also, as Gyama had discovered over 3 weeks of accidental proximity, possessed of the specific quality that made someone good to have nearby during bad situations. He did not panic, and he did not stop moving. He had joined Gyama's party by asking, earnestly and directly, whether Gyama would let him follow a person who was actually going somewhere. The question had been so artless that Gyama had said yes before he'd thought about it. The cave was straightforward for the first 40 minutes. Mermen organized in shallow water, coordinated by sound, aggressive when approached but poorly suited to land terrain. The party cleared the outer sections in good time. Speed weapons buff reduced fatigue across the group. Chloe moved through the formations like water finding cracks in stone. Leon was precise and controlled, as expected. Rachel hit things very hard and then hit them again to be certain. Then the cave opened into a deeper chamber. The chamber had a pool at its center, going down further than the light reached. The ambient sound changed, lower, with a resonance that wasn't echoes. Gyama stopped the group. He had played this dungeon on the game. He had played it all the way through to the reward screen. There had been nothing about a second creature. It came from beneath. What emerged from the pool was mermaid in approximate shape and nothing else in character. Standard mermen were aggressive fish. What surfaced from the dark water was something that had learned, over enough centuries, to be something more than what it started as. Its eyes processed the room in a way that eyes on creatures without deliberate thought did not process rooms. A sphere of force surrounded it, visible, slightly luminous, the containment field that the game's bestiary classified under demonoid, a beast that had crossed the line from animal to something with active magic behind its movements. It hit Leon first, one strike, from the tail, catching him as he moved to flank. Leon went into the cave wall with the force of something that had misjudged the density of the stone. He slid to the floor and did not immediately get up. His breathing was audible from across the chamber. Rachel moved and was immediately forced back by the pressure field. Not a hit, just a wall of force that pushed her 3 meters before she could plant her feet. Speed Weapon's flute was already up, running a stability buff, but his face had the look of someone doing arithmetic that wasn't coming out well. Gyama told Chloe to find the nearest island camp and bring help. She started to object. He said Leon needed medical attention now, not in 20 minutes, and she was the fastest person in the room. She looked at Leon on the floor. She looked at Gyama. She picked up Leon by the collar, checked his breathing, set him against the wall at the safest angle, and ran. The mermaid watched her go, then turned back to Gyama. He activated both blessings simultaneously. 30 seconds. The pressure field was the problem. It had a visible surface, a shimmer at the edge where energy sat denser than the air around it. In the game, a demonoid field like this required either overwhelming force to punch through, or a precise cut along the grain of the energy to split it, rather than resist it. Overwhelming force was not his specialty. Precision was. He moved left, drawing the mermaid's attention and its first strike. The tail came down with the force of something that understood its own mass and enjoyed it. He stepped the long way around, inside the arc, and let the kitchen knife trail along the field surface as he moved. The field sparked where the blade touched it. He filed the sensation, a specific resistance, the same way tougher cuts of fish pushed back differently than soft ones. He moved again, forcing another strike, trailing the blade. The field sparked in a slightly different place. He was reading the grain of it, the direction the energy ran. Speed Weapon was playing something faster, a rhythm that reduced friction in Gyama's joints rather than buffing raw strength. The flute player had read the situation correctly and switched compositions on his own initiative. Gyama noted this with approval. The mermaid was not slow. It adjusted between strikes, aligning the field to block rather than just defending passively. Something behind its eyes was calculating. This was the part the game hadn't included. The game version held still and let you figure it out. The living version was also figuring things out. His clock was at 15 seconds. He stopped moving sideways. He came straight in. The field resistance hit him at full force. A push that felt like running into furniture in the dark, jarring and total. He did not stop. He put the knife into the visible seam he had been reading for 30 meters of circling, angled along the grain rather than against it, and pushed. The field held. He leaned. The field split. The mermaid's next strike came with nothing between them. Gyama was already inside it. The sashimi knife went in at the angle that a chef uses to debone a particularly large fish. Not a power cut, a placement cut, measured and set. The demonoid's mechanics were not fundamentally different from anything biological. It had a structure. Structures had load-bearing points. He found 2 of them. His clock hit 0. The pain did not arrive all at once. It arrived in sequence, which was worse. Each joint reporting in turn, the body cataloging what the blessing had required of it. He stayed on his feet for 6 seconds by the particular stubbornness of someone who has been trained to finish the task before stopping. Then the cave floor was under his hands, and he was coughing something warm. Speed weapon was beside him. The flute had stopped. The chamber was quiet in the way of somewhere that recently contained a very loud thing. The mermaid was not moving. Rachel appeared from somewhere. She had not run, of course, because asking Rachel to leave a fight was structurally similar to asking a river to go backward, and pulled Gyama into a half-sitting position against the cave wall. She pressed a cloth against his mouth before he could object, her expression carrying the focused practicality of someone who had been around injuries enough to have preferences about how they were managed. He leaned against the stone and breathed carefully. Outside the cave, somewhere on the path through the trees, Chloe was running. She would find another group. She would tell them enough, without telling them too much, that help would come. She would run back faster than she had run out. He had approximately 12 minutes to rest before the situation became other people's business again. He used them. Media arrived before the official rescue team. She came through the cave entrance at a pace that suggested she had already been moving when Chloe found her, her shoes wet from the tide shelf outside. She took in the chamber in 3 seconds. Leon against the wall, the demonoid's remains, Gyama sitting with blood on his collar, Speed weapon still holding a cloth to Gyama's face out of sheer uncertainty about what else to do with his hands. She crouched in front of Gyama and looked at him the way a person looks at something they are assessing for damage before they decide how angry to be about it. He said he was fine. She said something under her breath that was not part of any language he recognized. The official report from Scopuli Island listed the dungeon as cleared. 60 mermen, standard difficulty, party of 5, no critical injuries. The demonoid was not in the report. Media had removed it before anyone else had the chance to add it, and the small number of people who knew what had actually happened in that cave received a look from her that served as a comprehensive policy statement on the subject. She and Siegfried came to Gyama's dormitory 3 days after they returned. Siegfried placed a sheathed sword on Gyama's desk without announcing what it was. The sheath was lacquered, the handle wrapped in plain cord, nothing elaborate. Gyama recognized the name when he unsheathed it. The Murasame, a B-rank blade with a reputation that preceded it by about 200 years. He told them he couldn't use a sword this length. Siegfried said he knew. He said he was curious what would happen. Media said it was a midterm reward for exceptional performance, and she could confirm that the paperwork was already filed. She said it with the expression of someone who has preemptively closed several doors. Gyama wrapped the sheath back around the blade, thought for a moment, and took it to the campus blacksmith the following afternoon. The blacksmith was a third-generation craftsman who had reforged weapons for 2 of the 7-star heroes and reportedly kept a personal list of people he refused to work for on grounds of insufficient aesthetic seriousness. He took the Murasame, unsheathed it, ran his thumb along the flat, and held it up to his workshop window for a full minute. Then he looked at Gyama and asked what he wanted done with it. Gyama described the shape, the length, the weight distribution, the angle of the bevel. The blacksmith set the sword down. He said Gyama was asking him to take a 200-year-old B-rank blade and reforge it into a kitchen knife. Gyama confirmed that was correct. The blacksmith looked at the sword. He looked at Gyama's carrying sleeve, where the sashimi knives sat. He looked back at the sword. Then he said his hourly rate and that he would need a week. And he said this with the tone of a man who had decided not to have any more feelings about the situation. He did extraordinary work. What came back was functionally an E-rank sashimi knife, in terms of grade classification, with a construction that contained, beneath the unremarkable surface, everything the Murasame had been. The blacksmith handed it over and said nothing. His expression contained everything he had chosen not to say. Siegfried joined Wolf class as a guest instructor on a Monday morning. He walked in, took the teaching position at the front of the room, and looked at the students with the unhurried attention of a man who had nowhere more important to be and had decided this fact was interesting. He said he was there to observe the class's practical development. He said this while looking specifically at Gyama. Gyama wrote today's date in his notebook. The first 3 sessions were conventional: technique reviews, footwork, grip correction. The old man moved through the room making adjustments with the one hand he still had, occasionally demonstrating something half-speed that was somehow still fast enough to be unsettling. Students rotated through the sparring floor in pairs. On Thursday, he asked Gyama to spar with him. Gyama thought about declining. He thought about it for slightly too long, and Siegfried's expression during the pause communicated that the window had closed. They faced each other on the practice floor. The mental realm was not a blessing. It was a condition, a state of total immersion in a single weapon's logic, reached by practitioners who had spent so long with one blade that the distinction between their thinking and the blade's movement had dissolved. Swordsmen who reached it were rare. The age at which they reached it was, historically, never younger than late 20s. Gyama had 20 years of knife work in his previous body. The new body was undertrained and thin. The experience was not stored in the muscle. It was stored somewhere else. He cleared his mind the way he had cleared it before every busy service in the restaurant. Not blank, just organized. The same way a clean counter is not empty but ready. His grip settled into the familiar low placement. His weight distributed without effort. He felt the mental realm arrive the way you feel a door open in a room where you didn't know there was a door. Siegfried stopped. Not in the physical sense. His feet were still planted, his posture unchanged. He stopped in the way that someone stops when they see something they were not prepared to see. He stood in the practice room with the Sword Emperor's entire 80 years of experience sitting behind his eyes and looked at the 17-year-old across from him. Then he entered the mental realm himself, and the room changed. It lasted 40 seconds. Media stopped it. She arrived at the gymnasium door, took one look through the observation window at what was happening on the floor, and walked in at a pace that was not running, but covered the distance in the time running would have. She put herself between them without touching either, and said, at a volume that left no room for misunderstanding, that the demonstration was complete. Siegfried stepped back. He was breathing at a rate that indicated he had not breathed during those 40 seconds. He told Gyama afterward, standing in the corridor while media spoke sharply to the practice room's recording system, that he had entered the mental realm at age 29. He said he had considered it among his significant achievements. He said this with the perfect equanimity of a man who had already completely reorganized his understanding of the situation and was simply reporting from the new position. He started coming to morning training as well. The Buffalo Dungeon recruitment happened in stages, neither of which was planned. Speed Weapon appeared at Gyama's lunch table on a Tuesday and said he had heard about a C-rank dungeon near the Southern District that had recently produced materials suitable for weapon enhancement. He said he was looking for a party and that he thought Gyama might be interested in the enhancement materials specifically. He placed a dungeon guide pamphlet on the table with the hopeful precision of someone who had prepared this approach. Gyama looked at the pamphlet. He thought about the Murasame-turned-sashimi knife sitting in its sheath on his desk, currently E-rank, currently occupying exactly 0 of its enhancement slots. He said probably next week. Speed Weapon immediately began scheduling. The third-party member was Saki Ryo. She was sitting on the classroom steps in Dragon class when Gyama came to find Speed Weapon for a pre-run equipment check. She was also asleep. Not in the helpless way of exhaustion, but in the deliberate way of someone who had decided sleeping was what was happening now and had arranged themselves accordingly. Her first-place academic ranking plaque was in her bag rather than on display. Her shoes were slightly untied. Speed Weapon whispered that she was the divine archer's daughter, top of every written exam, and apparently bored out of her mind. Gyama took out 3 kitchen knives and threw them at the wall beside the steps, evenly spaced. Saki opened her eyes. She looked at the knives. She looked at Gyama. Her expression passed through several stages of evaluation before settling on something that might have been interest. She said she had heard there was a dungeon run being organized. He said B-rank combat capability minimum. She stood up, pulled the knives out of the wall one-handed, and handed them back handle first, with the relaxed competence of someone who had handled edged weapons since early childhood. She said she met the requirement. She was in the party. The dungeon opened into a plain of dark soil and distant noise. Buffalo, 200 of them, in the first estimate, heavy, horned, moving in herds that created their own weather. The optimal approach was systematic. Clear the outer edges, compress toward the center, avoid provoking a coordinated stampede. Gyama had the map memorized from the game, and set the route accordingly. It went well for an hour. Then they reached the sealed stone gate at the dungeon's northern wall. It was not on any map. Not the dungeon authorities' registered layout, not the game version Gyama remembered. A gate sealed in standard containment stone, locked through a mechanism that required specific keys. The gate was locked. The lock was open. Someone had already used a key. Gyama turned. The gate groaned behind them. Through it, from the dark beyond the frame, came a sound that the 200 buffalo in the plain behind them apparently recognized. Because the herd turned all at once in a way, herds only turn when something worse than them has entered the area. The gate opened fully. The Buffalo King was not a large buffalo. It was the idea of a buffalo taken to a conclusion that ordinary buffaloes hadn't been informed about. 7 meters tall, wearing its own horn growth like a crown that had gotten completely out of hand, with the rolling gait of something that had never in its life needed to move quickly because everything in its vicinity had always moved first. Speed Weapon raised his flute without being asked. The fight was not about strength. Gyama's window was 50 seconds. He had taken one enhancement since the clinic and extended his pain immunity by 20 seconds, a discovery he had made by surviving long enough in the sword god state to notice the change in his body's feedback. 50 seconds of full activation, against a boss that could take a direct strike from a C-rank weapon and continue walking. He used 43 of them. Speed Weapon played a composition he had been developing since the Scopuli Island cave, a layered buff that reduced joint resistance specifically, calibrated to the frequency of Gyama's blessing activation. He had been analyzing the pattern of Gyama's movements in practice sessions without mentioning it. The result shaved approximately 15% of friction from every cut, which at the speed Gyama was operating meant the difference between a blade dragging and a blade arriving. The Buffalo King's horn took 3 direct strikes before it began to matter. The 4th was precisely placed at the base where the growth met bone. The 5th was where the crack became a split. By the time Gyama's clock expired, the king was going down with the heavy inevitability of something that had been standing on a foundation that no longer existed. He went to his knees on the dungeon floor and waited for the pain to finish introducing itself. Saki was beside him before he'd registered her moving. She put her hand on his back and said nothing, which was exactly the right amount of assistance for the situation. Speed Weapon was playing something low and stabilizing, equally correct. He found, once the worst of it passed, that he was grateful for both of them in a way he didn't examine too carefully. The Buffalo King's remains yielded a blessing of transition, a soul-bound ability that could transfer one blessing from its host to another person or object, temporarily. Gyama absorbed it and sat with the implications for a moment. He could share his regeneration. He could share healing through his own body's recovery rate. During the final exam season, if something went badly wrong for someone near him, he had a way to fix it that didn't involve anyone dying. He filed the information and said nothing about it. The corrupt dungeon worker who had planted the demon stone fragment, unlocking the sealed gate, engineering the Buffalo King encounter, was caught before they left the dungeon's antechamber. His confession identified a purple-haired female instructor as the person who had hired him. Chloe was standing nearest when he finished confessing. Gyama said her name. She looked at him. He gave a small nod. She moved. The worker was still restrained when she reached him, which meant the restraints ended the situation with him. Gyama had her clean her knife on the grass outside. He carried the worker's confession document himself. The dungeon authorities' paperwork would account for the death as a complication of the encounter. He had already worked through the report language in his head on the walk out. Nobody in the party asked him about any of this. They understood, at varying levels of precision, that the man had tried to have them killed and that the subject was now closed. Knox found him in the travel club's preparation room 2 weeks later. He sat down across the table with the deliberate care of someone who had thought about this conversation in advance. He was moving differently since the arena, not less capable, but more considered. Like something had been removed from his operating assumptions, and he was navigating without it. He said the Academy elders had issued a formal classification against Gyama, not a warning, a classification, which was the bureaucratic word for a category of threat that authorized specific responses. He said 2 of the elders had colluded with a demon faction, that their interest in Gyama specifically was not ideological, it was practical. Gyama was capable enough to threaten their arrangement, and the arrangement was more important to them than the student. He said the auditory internal investigation had been watching the elders for a separate reason, and that this convergence of targets was not accidental. Gyama listened. He thought about the purple-haired instructor still at large somewhere in the campus, and about the dungeon worker's confession, and about the way media had looked when he'd passed her the copy he'd kept. He thanked Knox. Knox stood to leave. At the door, he paused and said, without turning around, in the flat voice of someone delivering information with no emotional framing, that Chloe had been laughing at meals lately. He said he had noticed. He left. Gyama sat in the empty room for a while, looking at the club schedule pinned to the wall. Avalon Island was the site of the semester's survival training. The format was simple. Students dropped into forested terrain with standard supplies and left to demonstrate competence for 5 days. No class groupings, no assigned teams. Individual performance recorded by embedded observers. Gyama's plan was his usual plan, which was increasingly a formality. Show up, be quiet, leave. He set camp on the 2nd day in a hollow near a thermal spring, where the air was warm and the ground stayed dry. He built the fire with the efficiency of someone who had spent army months outdoors and found no romance in the task whatsoever. He had located the Blessing of Regeneration's documented spawn site on the island's eastern ridge, game knowledge, reliable, and planned to collect it quietly before anyone else arrived. The heroines, as it happened, had a different arrangement. He found out about it after Rachel had organized what she called a game, with rules she had apparently explained to Abel and Chloe and Saki. Whoever reached Gyama's camp first would monopolize his company for the training period. She had presented this as entertainment. The other 3 had received the proposal with varying degrees of skepticism and then participated anyway, which said something about the structure of the situation they were all in. Abel found the camp at dusk on day 2. She arrived from the south path with a scratch on her forearm from a branch and a posture that suggested she was pretending the arrival was casual. She stopped at the edge of the firelight and looked at the camp, the organized layout, the food suspended away from ground creatures, the bedding positioned at the optimal angle for heat retention. She sat down beside the fire without asking. They did not say much. He offered food. She ate with the concentrated attention of someone who had been rationing. The fire settled into its lower phase. She fell asleep sitting up, then sideways, then with her head at an angle that would have been uncomfortable by morning. He took his coat off and put it over her. He redistributed the food supplies beside the bedding where she'd find them easily. He banked the fire to a steady, low burn and walked to the tree line. He collected the Blessing of Regeneration from the eastern ridge before sunrise. She was awake when he returned, standing in the camp with the coat in her hands and a specific expression on her face. The expression was not gratitude, it was something harder to name, the look of someone who has just discovered a gap in their own history they hadn't known was there. She had spent 10 years as Abel von Nibelung, granddaughter of the Sword Emperor, heir to a name that meant something in every room she entered. In 10 years, nobody had covered her with a coat in the night and left supplies and asked nothing. He walked past her to the fire. He said good morning. He said there was dried fish if she wanted it. She said his name, very quietly. He looked up. She was crying. Not dramatically, she was not a dramatic person, but her eyes were wet, and she was looking at him with the particular intensity of someone who has just been ambushed by a feeling they had no category for. He turned back to the fire. He said the fish was already salted, so it was ready to eat cold if she preferred. He gave her the time to collect herself without making the collection into an event. She sat down and ate the fish. She did not say anything about the coat or the supplies. She tucked them into her pack with the careful movements of someone storing something they intended to keep. They sat by the dying fire for an hour without speaking, in the way of people who have moved past the point where silence requires explanation. Leon was waiting at the Blessing of Regeneration site. He had Balmong, the holy demon sword, the game's signature weapon for its protagonist, and he was holding it with the particular ease of someone who had been carrying it long enough to have opinions about it. He turned when Gyama arrived and said, without preamble, that he wanted to fight. Gyama asked why. Leon said he thought Gyama would understand. He said it in the tone of someone making a statement they expected to be recognized rather than explained. Gyama looked at the sword. Balmong was a significant weapon, legendary tier, documented for 2 centuries, designed to exist in the hands of a specific kind of hero. He had read the game entries for it during his previous life's lunch breaks. He knew what it could do. He took out the reforged Murasame. They fought for 4 minutes. Leon was not slow, he was not weak. He had developed a swordsmanship that combined his native ability with a weapon designed to enhance and guide its user, and the combination was genuinely impressive in the way that well-engineered things are impressive. Everything placed correctly, nothing wasted. He came in with a composite approach that tested distance, angle, and timing in the first 30 seconds. The kitchen knife found the seam in Balmong's guard at 40 seconds. A single cut, placed where the blade geometry narrowed at a specific grip position Leon was favoring with his left hand. The contact was minimal, the sound small. A nick in Balmong's edge. Leon stopped. He looked at his sword. He looked at the nick. He looked at Gyama. He said, quietly, with a quality of honesty that sat outside the usual social negotiations of the school, that he had apparently spent 6 months believing he was further along than he was. He said this was useful information. He walked away through the trees. Gyama stood at the ridge site and collected the blessing of regeneration from the marked stone, which pulsed once and settled into his chest, as a warmth he could feel in the specific way of something that has become part of you rather than attached to you. 2 blessings now that he could transfer. 2 ways to keep someone alive who might otherwise not make it. He headed back toward camp. The island around him was quiet, the kind of quiet that sits before the next thing arrives. The Undertaker Syndicate came that night. He heard them at the perimeter 20 minutes before they reached the camp. 8 mercenaries, professional in the way that people who do unpleasant work efficiently are professional. They moved quietly and with intention, taking positions before the lead man announced the contract. The lead man was Rui Shen, the syndicate's principal operative, reputation extending across 3 countries, currently carrying a blade whose grade put him in the discussion, alongside academy instructors. Gyama dealt with 7 of them at a pace that left the operational situation somewhat one-sided. He left Rui Shen standing. He asked who had commissioned the contract. Rui Shen, to his credit, said nothing. He was professional in that way too. Then something changed in Rui Shen's face. Not the expression, but what was behind it. A pressure. A reorganization of what was operating the eyes. The posture shifted, and it was not Rui Shen's posture anymore. The voice that came from Rui Shen's throat was not Rui Shen's voice. Igor, 5th Legion commander of the Demon Army, had not walked in the human world for 700 years. She emerged wearing a mercenary's body, like a borrowed coat, adjusting her presence into the new space with the ease of something that had done this before, across 7 centuries of patience. She was a succubus flame demon, not the ornamental kind that appeared in mythology illustrated books, but the original architecture, something built for possession, manipulation, and the kind of fire that did not respond to water. She looked at Gyama with the focused interest of a collector examining a piece they had not expected to find here. She said he exceeded the hero they had been monitoring. She said demonkind had an interest in a vessel of his quality. He said he preferred not. She smiled and moved. He held for 6 minutes. The blessing of painlessness cycling in and out. Activate, suppress, fight, expire, endure, reload. His timing was accurate. His placement was precise. She was faster and older and operating on 700 years of accumulated expertise, and none of that fully mattered because the sword god's blessing had not been issued with a concern for what it was fighting, only for how well it cut. His pain immunity hit its last window and ran out, and he went to the ground. Siegfried came from the tree line. The Sword Emperor fought one-armed against a demon general and lasted longer than anyone born in the past 500 years would have lasted, and it was not enough. A blast hit him at close range, through the stomach, the kind of force that expressed its opinion about the human body's structural integrity in specific and unambiguous terms. He went down. He was breathing, barely. Igor stepped over him toward Gyama. She placed her hand against Gyama's forehead and pressed her demon mark into it. A possession attempt, the force of it entering like a splinter entering wood, looking for the gap between the host and whatever lived in the host. The system had opinions about this. He felt the synchronization stat activate with a clarity that was nothing like the previous partial triggers. The synchronization had always been there. Fifth stat, question marks where the value should be, locked access from the first day. It had jumped after fights, crept upward through the semester, sat at a number he could see but not operate. At Igor's mark, it moved the final distance and locked into place at 100. Pseudo-invocation, every blessing at once. His body given a ceiling beyond any human category and a timer of approximately 60 seconds to exist above it. He descended, the darkness covering the sky above the island, the ambient field that Igor had been generating from the moment she arrived, had texture he could see now. The fire she was building in her right hand had a structure. The gap between what she was doing and where he could put a blade was not a gap at all. She looked at him. She had not expected to be looked at. Not like this. Not by something she could not immediately classify. He could see the recognition arriving in her expression. Not fear, but the recalibration of a very old creature discovering that something in its category system was wrong. The thousand sword technique was not a technique in the sense that it had been taught to him, or that he had practiced it. It was what the sword god's full expression looked like when the body carrying it was given 60 seconds to be equal to the ability. It arrived through him rather than from him. He moved into Igor's fire and through it, and the blade found the geometry of her form at the precise point where flame demons were not simply fire but structure, and cut along that line. The sky opened. Morning light came in through the split. Actual sunrise, the natural kind, arriving through a gap in the dark field that had no business being cut open, because darkness wasn't something that had edges you could find. And yet, Igor's form separated. The pieces did not immediately stop existing. Demons of her tier persisted at partial integrity, but she was no longer operational in any relevant sense. See freed, bleeding from the stomach, his remaining arm barely supporting his weight, moved behind the lingering form. He said his own name. The Sword Emperor announced himself to the opponent for the first time in the fight, in the voice of a man who considered this the correct final courtesy, and his blade went in from behind. He said, to whatever remained of her in that moment, never turn your back on the enemy. She went out. Gyama came back from the invocation state the way a tide goes out. Not violently, just a removal of something enormous that had been here and was now not. He was on his knees in the grass. The sky above was open and ordinary, the kind of sky an island had in early morning, with birds beginning somewhere in the trees. Siegfried was on the ground 8 meters away. He crossed the distance and put his hands on the old man's chest wound. The blessing of regeneration passed through transition in 3 seconds. He could feel his own healing rate moving into another person, which was a sensation without good comparison, like pouring water into a shape you couldn't see. The bleeding slowed. The old man's breathing deepened. Siegfried opened his eyes. He looked at Gyama's face for a long moment. He said, "Your hair is white." Gyama reached up. His hair had gone entirely white at the roots from the synchronization strain. The blessing had taken what it needed from the body to sustain itself. He ran his fingers through it and thought about this for a moment. He said he would figure something out. The old man made a sound that might have been a laugh if his ribs had been in a condition that permitted full expression of it. They waited for dawn to fully arrive. The island around them came back to life at its ordinary pace. Birds, wind, water, indifferent to what had just happened here, and entirely correct to be so. The academy returned to its ordinary rhythms in the way that institutions return to ordinary rhythms. Not because things were ordinary, but because the schedule continued, and the schedule was stronger than any single event. Gyama came back from Avalon Island with white roots in his dark hair, a new blessing, and a cover story that media had assembled in the 3 days before the students returned. The incident was classified. The island's embedded observers had their recordings reviewed and redacted. Rui Shen's body was processed through the Dungeon Authority's missing persons framework. Igor's involvement was documented in a file that sat in a drawer in media's office rather than the general archive. C.F. Freed had a new arm situation to adapt to. He adapted with the equanimity of someone who had spent 80 years adjusting to outcomes he hadn't chosen. Saki was in the Wolf class corridor when Gyama walked in on the first morning back. She was leaning against the wall with a textbook she was not reading, doing what she often did in public spaces, constructing the appearance of someone doing something while actually monitoring everything. When he turned the corner, she pushed off the wall and crossed the corridor in 3 steps and flicked him on the forehead. Not hard. The precise force of someone communicating a feeling they had decided not to express verbally. She held his gaze for 1 moment, then turned and walked to class without explaining. He stood in the corridor rubbing his forehead and thought that this was, in its way, the clearest welcome back he had received. The dream arrived 4 days after the island. He was in a space without particular geography, not darkness, not light, more the quality of somewhere that existed because it needed to, rather than because it had been built. The god of the sword was present in the way that something very old is present. Not a body, not a voice in the conventional sense, but a weight and a direction that carried meaning. The guidance was simple: keep cutting, no matter what. The phrase arrived less as instruction than as the acknowledgement of a direction already chosen, a confirmation rather than a command. There was a secondary content he could feel, but not fully receive, something about an error from a prior time that the deity had not yet resolved, but the edges of it were unclear, and the transmission cut before it landed whole. He woke up at 3 in the morning with the specific alertness of someone who has been in a conversation that has not finished. He lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and thought about synchronization and what the number climbing meant and what it would eventually reach. He got up and sharpened his knives. The repetition of the task organized the thoughts that didn't need organizing and quieted the ones that did. Siegfried made his announcement at the next faculty assembly, which Gyama was not attending but heard about within 40 minutes through 3 separate sources. The Sword Emperor was retiring from the 7 stars. His successor, whom he intended to nominate through formal protocol within the academic year, was a first-year Wolf class student currently ranked first in the school under a confidentiality arrangement. Media had apparently heard this at the same time as everyone else, which was the detail that Gyama found most significant. She came to find him in the travel club room that afternoon. She stood in the doorway for a moment before saying anything, and whatever she intended to lead with, she changed it. She said Siegfried was going to make everything complicated. Gyama said he was aware of that. She said the elders would escalate. The 7-star succession process involved a public announcement, a review period, and then a formal transfer, meaning Gyama's name would eventually enter official records in a way that the confidentiality arrangement would no longer contain. He said he was aware of that too. She looked at him with the expression she sometimes had when she was deciding whether to be frustrated or impressed and hadn't landed yet. She left without resolving it. The festival came in the 4th month. The travel club ran a food stall. Gyama's organizational contribution, which media had approved through the school office after an administrator told her that a special admission students club was an inappropriate use of festival space. The administrator was no longer employed by the academy. Media had handled the paperwork personally, and with what appeared to be enthusiasm. The stall did well. Speed Weapon managed the front. Saki operated the logistics. Chloe stood near the cooking area with an expression that persuaded customers to make their decisions quickly and pleasantly. Gyama cooked. Mao Rang appeared mid-afternoon. She was the Mao twins' older sister, the second-ranked hero candidate in the international classification, a woman who moved through public spaces with the specific confidence of someone who has never meaningfully lost. She stopped at the stall, looked at the food, and said several things about the quality of the presentation and the appropriateness of a Wolf-class student running a public demonstration of anything. Gyama came out from behind the counter and said there was a subspace arena available through the school office. She accepted immediately. This was the problem with people who had never lost. They experienced challenge as opportunity. The subspace duel lasted less than a minute. Mao Rang was genuinely excellent. Her swordsmanship was not the Mao twins' cruelty dressed up as skill. It was the real article, trained across years by people who knew what they were doing, refined through the kind of competition that would have made most fighters in the school feel they were watching something beyond their category. She moved with the economy of a person who wasted nothing. The mental realm was not something she could counter. She came in with a combination that would have ended 90% of opponents at her tier. Gyama read it at the entry point, the slight lean before the first movement, the weight shift that preceded the conversion, and stepped into the geometry of it rather than away. He was inside her range before she reached full extension. Her guard was arranged for someone moving backward. He was not moving backward. The finishing movement was won. The subspace rendering, in these situations, registered the outcome and froze the field before anything permanent occurred. Mao Rang found herself looking at the ceiling of the subspace with her sword 3 meters away, having not landed a single cut. She lay there for a moment. Then she sat up and looked at Gyama, with the specific expression of someone whose self-assessment has just been provided with new information it did not request. She said, with the flatness of genuine recognition rather than performative humility, that he was a true monster. She left. The recording, which had been broadcast to the festival's general screen by a student who had recognized the duel participants and made an editorial decision, had already been seen by approximately 400 people. By morning it had circulated further. The nickname arrived through channels he didn't track and couldn't prevent, the sashimi hero, for the weapons in his hands and the way the fight had ended. He went back to the food stall. The line was longer. He discovered his parents were gone during the written exam period. He called their number on the morning of the third exam, before sunrise, the way he had called it every few weeks since arriving in this world, to hear their voices, to mark that the connection still existed. The automated message said the number was not in service. He sat on his dormitory floor. He called again. The same message. He opened the photo gallery in his phone, the pictures he had been adding to since he arrived, small records of ordinary days. The most recent photos were intact. The older ones were becoming something else. Where his parents' faces should have been, there was a visual softness at the center. The image still present, but the specific detail. The eyes, the expression, the thing that made the face a person, no longer resolving into anything recognizable. He held the phone for a long time. He went and looked their names up in every database the school network could reach. The records did not exist. Not missing. Not flagged as deleted or restricted. Absent. The way things are absent when they were never there to begin with. Someone had removed them from reality with enough thoroughness to reach backward into photographs. He put the phone down. He went to the exam. He scored well. He came back to his room and sat in the chair by his desk in the dark for an hour, which was the amount of time it took for the part of him that was going to feel the full weight of this to finish feeling it, and the part that was going to keep moving to take over again. He could not remember their faces from memory. He reached for the image, the specific particular faces of the people he had been living alongside for months, and found the space where the memory should be occupied by something that felt like texture without content. He knew they existed. He knew he had cared about them. The caring remained, and the specific shape of what he had cared about did not. He sharpened his knives again, the counter in the dark, the motion of something practiced enough to require nothing from consciousness. The final practical exam used the pavilion, an artificial Gehenna environment, a construct that generated terrain and atmospheric conditions replicating the demon army's favored battlefield. Unlike subspace, injuries sustained in the Gehenna environment did carry forward. This distinction had been disclosed to students during the pre-exam briefing, and most of them had treated it as an elevated difficulty notice rather than a structural warning. The villain instructors who had been placed inside the Gehenna by the Elders Network had treated it as an operational opportunity. Gyama's group reached the Tower of Trial at the midpoint and found Leon's group already there, pinned, both sides under pressure from instructors who moved with the precision of people who had been briefed on their targets specifically. Leon was down. Saki was bleeding from the side, standing through effort alone, her bow still in her hands. Gyama moved through the tower in the way water moves through a building when the structure has failed, finding every path, filling every space. He had Choiceall's sword taken from where he'd found it earlier in the run, a blade that met the length condition, and the blessing of painlessness cycling in its window. The villain instructors were capable. They were not prepared for something that fought like a sashimi knife against the grain of their defensive assumptions. He dismantled them. Saki was the one who finished it from her side. She had been maintaining an upright position through what he could now see was a deliberately concealed poison resistance, a secondary blessing she had not disclosed during any of the team preparation sessions. Ariel, the instructor assigned to her group, had been relying on a poison-based combat style that should have ended things in the first minute. Saki had waited through 4 minutes of the poison's expected progression, let Ariel fully commit to her assumption, and then responded with the accuracy of someone who had been waiting for the moment to arrive. She was on her feet when Gyama reached her side of the floor. She was also immediately after this no longer on her feet. The resistance had maintained her, and the resistance was now finished. and her body registered several minutes of accumulated injury at once. He caught her. She landed against his chest and said, barely above a whisper, that she would like to stay there for just a moment before anyone else arrived. She said it with her eyes closing, and her voice very precise, as though this was a preference she had decided to communicate accurately while she still could. He held her and used transition to pass the regeneration blessing into her bloodstream. He felt the healing begin, and kept still, which was what she had asked for. She woke 3 days later in the clinic, and threw a pillow at Speedweapon for reasons she chose not to explain. The travel club and Rachel had spent those 3 days compiling a staff list. Names, cross-referenced against Saki's network access, and Nox's auditory intelligence, building the map of the Elder's internal network that nobody had been willing to fully draw before. The final list had 11 names. 3 were currently in the building. Media took the list. She read it twice. She folded it into her jacket pocket and said they would need the Sword Emperor. Elder Clay's private mansion sat outside the Academy District in the organized quiet of old money that has decided its own neighborhood needs no explanation. When they arrived, Gyama, Siegfried, Media, Nox, and 4 of the auditory elite, the mansion was already a disaster. Professor Damien had gotten there first and had his own conclusions about how the evening should proceed. The Elder's guards were down throughout the ground floor. Evidence of the finger snap magic Damien used, orbs that he detonated with a pressure point gesture, each one placed before the relevant conversation began, was visible in the scorch patterns across the entry hall. Damien was at the center of the main room, adjusting his cuffs. He looked at Gyama with the considered attention of a man who has been moving pieces for months and has just confirmed the most important one is on the board. He said he needed a vessel. He said Gyama would serve the 2nd Legion commander's purposes in a way the other hero candidates could not. Gyama was already looking at the threads. The orbs were visible once he knew what to look for. A skill that sat adjacent to the mental realm. Not the same thing, but using the same principle. Total attention to the weapon's logic, extended here to the logic of the environment. Damien's orbs were not independent. They ran on threads from his hands, invisible at ordinary attention, present at full concentration. The threads were the system, the orbs were the expression. He cut the threads. Damien activated another set. He cut those. Damien moved to his secondary approach, the orbs placed before the fight, already positioned, detonation contingent on a second gesture. Gyama read the room. He found the threads leading back to the placed orbs and cut them in sequence, moving through the room at a pace that made the cuts feel continuous rather than individual. Damien stood without functioning weapons for the first time in the fight. He looked at his hands. He looked at Gyama. He said nothing. Media had Elder Clay in the eastern room. The interrogation was thorough and medical in the specific sense of someone who was trained to cause and reverse damage, and found the reversibility made the process sustainable. The old man eventually made a request. She honored it, in the way of someone who has determined that mercy and justice can share the same moment. Nox handled the remaining network personnel with auditory efficiency. By morning, the mansion was quiet. The Elder's structure was finished. Siegfried formalized the succession announcement the following week. He gave his first public interview in 11 years for the sole purpose of stating that he was resigning his 7-star position and beginning the nomination process for his chosen successor. The journalist asked for the name. He said it would be announced in due course. He said it with the mild stubbornness of a man who has lived long enough to find deadlines amusing. The Nibelung estate in Switzerland occupied a valley where the cold had the clean, uncomplicated quality of cold that had been there longer than the buildings. Gyama arrived with Siegfried and Abel at the start of summer break, carrying 2 knives and a single bag that the old man looked at and did not comment on. Training took the form of silence. Not the silence of a teacher waiting for a student to catch up. The silence of 2 swordsmen existing in the same space with the same instrument, where the practice was being in proximity to something serious enough to require full attention. Siegfried would move through a form in the morning courtyard, one-armed, unhurried, and Gyama would watch and then respond. No corrections. The response was the lesson. The correction came from noticing where the response diverged from what the form had asked. He trained through the pain cycles deliberately. Full activation, full duration, full consequence. Building tolerance not by avoiding the cost but by paying it repeatedly, until the body developed an opinion about the process that was slightly less overwhelming than before. The spear saint arrived unannounced on the fourth day. Risha Dara had the compressed energy of someone who is trained to deliver maximum force in minimum space and never fully turns it off. She looked at Gyama with the assessment of a person who has recently reviewed a file and wants to check it against the source. She asked several pointed questions about Avalon Island, demon general encounters, and the mechanics of the 500% synchronization rating that the Hero Association had flagged in the data they'd pulled from Igor's aftermath. Siegfried told her that his students' training was not a matter for the association's administrative interest. Risha told Siegfried what she thought about that characterization. They continued this for approximately 8 minutes in the estate courtyard, while Gyama drank tea on the steps. The argument had the quality of two people who had known each other for decades and had long since decided that disagreement was its own form of conversation. Eventually, Risha concluded the visit, looked at Gyama one more time with the expression of someone putting a note in a place they would revisit, and left. Abel found him in the estate kitchen on a Thursday morning, early, when the light through the window was still thin and the valley outside held the specific blue of high altitude before sunrise. She said she was hungry and that the kitchen was not a space she had strong intuitions about. He made breakfast. She sat at the counter and ate without performing enjoyment, which he had come to recognize as how she expressed that something was good. They walked to Geneva afterward. Her suggestion, offered with the slight diffidence of someone proposing something they expected to be declined. He agreed. They took the train into the city and ate lunch at a restaurant near the lake, where the menu was in French, and the tables had enough distance between them for real conversation. She told him about her parents. She said it directly, the way she did most things. Her father and mother had gone into an undead dungeon 10 years ago, the two of them, into a rated S environment that had claimed every party before them. Neither returned. The academy had classified the dungeon as a closed loss. She had been 11 and had subsequently developed a comprehensive and functional relationship with not expecting people to come back. She said this with the controlled voice of someone who has told the story enough times to have found the shape that makes it survivable to tell. He said he would go with her. She looked at him. He said he had information about that dungeon. He said it as a general claim, which was technically true and technically not the full explanation, and that the information suggested the situation inside might be different from the official classification. She said this was not his problem. He said he was aware of that. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked out at the lake and said nothing, which was her version of yes. The undead dungeon was 3 kilometers from the estate, at the end of a forest road marked by a stone inscription so old it had lost its top portion. Siegfried had apparently known about it for 8 years. He told them this when they returned, which was characteristic of him and also, Gyama recognized, a deliberate choice. He had damaged the entrance inscription himself, removing the upper section that identified the dungeon's contents, to prevent parties from entering and dying for a decade. He had been waiting for someone who could go in and come out. They went in with Shia, Abel's family maid, a Joaquin Academy graduate and top 10% rated hero, who had been at the estate since before Abel's parents disappeared, and who had apparently never stopped looking for a reason to go after them. The dungeon was full. The undead had accumulated for a decade under a sovereign intelligence that organized them the way a mind organizes its own thoughts, purposefully, with structure. They moved through 3 levels of this in roughly 2 hours, Gyama running his pain window in careful intervals, Shia providing the combat support of someone who had been technically excellent and emotionally patient for 10 years, and was now finally doing the thing she had been patient for. They found Michelin on the 3rd level. He was sitting on a stone bench near a sealed door, 700 years undead, wearing the clothes of someone who had dressed for a particular occasion and then had to wait. His jaw was in poor condition from the centuries. Gyama healed it through regeneration without being asked. A field repair, imprecise but functional. Enough. Michelin spoke with the deliberate precision of someone rediscovering how their mouth worked. He said Abel's parents had come here. He said her father was further in. He said the dungeon's final boss held the key to what had happened. He guided them to the last chamber and stayed at the entrance. There was something about the doorway, he said, that he was not made to pass through. The Lich King called Drager was 7 meters of assembled darkness and command authority. The kind of boss that had been constructed by 10 years of a dungeon's power feeding back into its own apex. Gyama fought it the way he fought everything. Timed, placed, looking for the structural point under the surface performance. A Lich King's immortality ran through a specific object, its anchor, its phylactery. Find the stone and break it, and the thing holding the king in place released. He found it, while Abel fought through the outer horde in the chamber's lower section, cutting a path with the precise fury of someone who has been waiting 10 years to get here and intends to arrive. He broke the crystal. The darkness holding the Lich King's form together began resolving into something that was actually there. A person. Or what a person becomes after 10 years of being the capstone of a dungeon's intelligence. Present enough to stand and look at his daughter one more time. Orion von Nibelung gave Abel his sword. He held her face between his hands for a moment. Then he dissolved the way things dissolve when the anchor is gone. Not dramatically, not all at once, just gradually becoming less present until the absence was the only thing left. Abel held the sword with both hands and did not try to say anything to the empty air. She stood in the chamber and was very still. The stillness was not the stillness of someone who had gone away. It was the stillness of someone who was fully there and choosing not to move until they were ready. Shia put her hand on Abel's shoulder. Neither spoke. Michelin was fading by the time they returned to the third level. Not from injury, from whatever logic had kept him present for 7 centuries, now resolving since the dungeon's purpose had been fulfilled. He sat on the stone bench and looked at Gyama with the attention of someone who has one piece of information left to communicate and not much time in which to communicate it. He said there had been a hero here, long before his own time. Black hair and black eyes. The style of swordsmanship matched no school Michelin had ever seen documented. Compact, kitchen derivative in its efficiency, built around short blades. He said this hero had taught the wandering one-armed knight, who later taught the sword emperor. He said the lineage went back to a starting point that was difficult to locate. He said this while looking specifically at Gyama's hands. He faded gradually, with the equanimity of someone who has had 700 years to develop an opinion about impermanence and has landed in a comfortable place with it. The bench was empty. The dungeon was quiet. Gyama stood in the third level and thought about timelines and reincarnation and the specific possibility that the sequence of cause and effect was not as linear as it normally presented itself. He thought about his parents' faces, which he could not recover. He thought about the synchronization number still climbing and what it was climbing toward. He thought, keep cutting, no matter what. They walked out of the dungeon into afternoon light. The valley was exactly as they had left it. The estate was 3 kilometers away. Abel walked with her father's sword across her back and did not speak on the road, and nobody asked her to. Siegfried was waiting at the gate. He looked at them, one at a time. He asked no questions and said nothing about the 8 years. He held the gate open and followed them inside. 3 days later, a message arrived from Speed Weapon. He was in the United States, with Saki and Rachel, who had followed a press statement Gyama had given about his summer travel plans, and discovered it was wrong by the time they landed. All mute, a contact of Rachel's, had been no help in locating him. They were returning. Saki's message, forwarded by Speed Weapon because she had apparently declined to send it directly, said that when she got back she had something to say, and would prefer he was standing still when she said it. He read this twice. He put the phone down and looked at the valley. The 2nd Legion commander was somewhere inside the Academy's structure, connected to the professor he had already defeated, beginning whatever the next sequence of problems was preparing to be. His family existed only in the certainty of a feeling without a face to attach it to. His name was in the 7-star succession process. The Demon War was approximately 3 years and arriving. The sword was on the table. The morning light was exactly the kind of morning light a Swiss valley produces in summer. Specific and very clear, and not interested in what you thought you were doing. He picked up the knife. He began the forms. Whatever was coming next, he would be ready the only way he knew how to be ready. Not by accumulating power for its own sake, not by becoming something that the world had decided he was supposed to become. Just by being better at the one thing he had ever been serious about. Outside the estate walls, the valley was quiet. Somewhere in it, summer continued. Somewhere beyond it, the 2nd semester waited, and the threads of every unresolved thing pulled gently toward whatever came next. He kept cutting,